So this video is a continuation of the prior one where we showcase both error and loading states happening simultaneously, leading to a pretty bad user experience. This type of state management is a bug. This happens a lot in UX. Instead of having multiple states like this that introduces lots of different combinations that leads to bugs in UI, sometimes it's best to consolidate all of these states into a unified approach. Having a use reducer hook by consolidating both isLoading and isError states into it will be the smart choice. Reducer is much better than state management in that reducer has the capability of dispatching state and also an action, which has types that allows you to write switch case to determine what needs to be done. If you just use state, there's going to be a whole bunch of if and else, and at some point you're going to make some mistakes. So it's better to consolidate all of them into one unified approach using reducer, which is what this demo is going to be. There's going to be quite a bit of code. You may want to refer to the use reducer. There's some examples here. Be mindful that whenever you use reducer, the most important thing is to have reducer and also initial state. We're going to consolidate both. So we're going to take these two out and push them into reducer. So we need to initialize these. In our prior examples, our bookmark state initializes to this empty array. Having multiple states inside a reducer, we actually need to create a JavaScript object. So JavaScript object is different than array in that JavaScript object is a collection of key value pairs. Now we're slotting everything into key value pairs. We need to distinguish the isError, isLoading, and also the bookmark key value pairs. Let's say if all of our bookmark state to be inside of this data. So we need to change a little bit here later on. The key for the bookmark state is going to be data, and the value is this empty array. Same thing is loading. Key is called isLoading, and the value that we're initializing it with is false. The same thing with isError too. So isError is going to have an initial value of false. So this is how we initialize our data. Sometimes it's better to expand this vertically so you can see this better. This is purely the syntax. There's a couple of things that we need to do too. First of all, there's no more set. Instead of having a set, we'll just have a whole bunch of dispatch. And dispatch bookmark is the one that we need to update. Instead of having this loading, let's do this one at a time. Instead, dispatch bookmark, which is a function that takes a JavaScript object. Now, we don't know what this object is yet. We just know that there is some sort of type associated with it. Remember, dispatch bookmark has both type and payload. Payload is optional. isLoading and isError, they're basically just a Boolean, true or false. We can set that value directly inside this bookmark reducer using a switch type. We don't need to pass the current state of that load and error, which is just a Boolean, into it. So there is no more payload for this easy flag setters. Instead, what we're going to do is to define a couple of action types just to be on a safe side. If you go back here, it looks like there is a couple of states that we need to consolidate under bookmarks. One of them is the network error. So this network error happens when you encounter a promise reject. So this promise reject right here, right? So this is a set error. There's also a set bookmark, which is the new dispatch. So we have to have some sort of bookmark loading initialization state, which is happening right here. There is also set error, bookmark loading failure. If you are successfully able to load everything, then what we need to do is to set another dispatch that says, hey, this loading has been successful. So there's a couple of these things that we need to do. We're going to name this initialization set loading initialization with a name. Bookmarks loading init. So this is when everything just gets started. So we need to type this one to this string value. We're going to say when you successfully obtain stuff, that state is going to be success. What success? Loading success. The set error here is going to be bookmark loading failure. So let's change this set is error to a dispatch. Get rid of this. We have dispatch bookmark, and this is type bookmarks loading failure. Okay. All right, so let's expand this. I wanted to make sure actually this is fine. There is type. The payload here is not optional because we're setting the new result. So you have to pass this payload from before. And because we have the is set loading, so this is not necessary. And so is this one. So overall, we have bookmark loading initialization, and there is a success, and there's also an error handling right here. So there's a whole bunch of them here that would account for the two states here. In addition, we just need to make sure that this switch case is going to have three of these things. The loading init, that takes the action payload. This is the same example that we have. There's also success. Let's just write this out first. And there's also another case, and this one is a failure. So we want to make sure that we have all of these set here. Now we're going to fill up the rest of it here. Let's ask ourselves, what's going on when loading is a success? Well, loading is a success. This returns actually from before. This used to be set loading was true. Now let's go back to bookmark loading init. So what we need to do is to return a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, the state information. So what is the state information? The state information is the one that we passed in initially when we dispatch. That information says everything about the loading and error and state in the bookmarks. So I mentioned this before. You can use the JavaScript spread operator. It basically allows all of the state that you pass in before consolidating into a state. And I say this state has a whole bunch of stuff. Having this spread operator says we want to maintain all of the key value pairs from the current state object as a return object back into where this batch came from. And the other one is error. We want to say is loading. So if this is loading, then is loading is going to be true. What about is error? Is error is going to be false. So this is all good. So we want to return all three of these things. The state that came from, because we're not changing the state, so we're using the JavaScript spread operators to pass all of the original key value pairs back. In this case, the original key value pair is just that data empty array right here. This is the original state, right? This state is the bookmarks.data that has the empty array in there. Success is a little different though. So this action payloads are new data. This new data is this right here, which is the bookmark. So again, let's just make this into an object. And this object is going to have ... state. And this object is going to have is loading. If you have loading success, that means loading is false, right? Because you don't want to display is loading anymore. Is error is also false, right? Because loading success means there's no error. Data part is action payload. So remember, all of your reducer takes two things, right? One is the state and the other one is action. Action has two things. One is type and the other one is payload. So you want to return the entire payload back to where it came from. This will set the bookmark, the state info, and the failure part. We also want to return the same state as is. We're not changing it. So this is going back to where it came from, and loading is going to be false because when you get a network failure, there's no more loading, right? You want to kill the loading. So that wasn't the case before in the previous example where we have both loading and error on the same time, causing bad user experience. This is error is true. Okay, notice that for both init and failures, we're not returning any data back. And that is because the state is simply just a primitive. The payload part is optional in your dispatch. If you don't have it, like this case, we're not sending the payload back. I can just set the value using the primitive, eliminating the need to have to send the payload in. For the bookmark itself, this payload is important because we need to use this payload to send that information back to set the bookmarks, which is stored inside this data key value pairs. This list is responsible for printing out stuff. This list is constructed, right? Is loading and list. If this is not loading, then this will be instantiated because we know that the data inside the bookmark is stored inside the bookmarks.data. We need to send the bookmark data, and inside that data, iterate through every single one of them to get the URL and title as before. So let's just make sure that there are no error here. We're talking about both is error and is loading encapsulated inside of the bookmark reducer state. This reducer state has data, has is loading and error. Make sure that we call the bookmarks. Bookmarks is error, and this is our bookmarks is loading. So that will get us that. Either you want to have bookmarks data here, or you can have bookmark data here, which is kind of confusing. Normally, either you place the high level or a lower level. I would put the data back here. Okay, let's just review this entire thing. when we render our app for the very first time, Reducer has a initialization portion. This calls for bookmark having these key value pairs. Data empty, is loading false, is error false. By virtue of being rendered for the very first time, it will dispatch this bookmark reduce state, which calls our reducer here. And this state says bookmark init. Your state is going to be returned as it is, unchanged, but your loading is going to be true, error is going to be false. That false forces a render of your entire thing here, showing that your loading is on. So that's going to show the loading sign. So at some point, your reject is going to happen 3 seconds later. This is going to kick off your promise. This promise then results in our error right here. Your promise eventually is going to be caught with a reject, and this error says, please dispatch this bookmark with this type here. So that dispatch is going to call our reducer again, taking over this. This entire state is not going to change. The original state, your bookmark hasn't changed. What we want to do is set the error true. If the error is true, and this goes back to our components again, your component detects that change, re-render what's going on here. And the only thing that gets rendered is actually this is error. You don't render this part because the loading has been false already. So this is the beauty of having your entire state management logic inside of your bookmark reducer. Your error just happens, it's displayed. Since we are artificially injecting a network error, there is no success. So we're not rendering. Your state doesn't change, but what gets changed is your data. So your data section is returning your action payload. This entire payload was set in this area where if your bookmark data is returned, it will set the result in the payload with this type. In your reducer, the logic says when the loading is a success, set both is loading and error to false, returning everything else as is. So this is how we render our information from beginning to end. Your app component has a complex reduce state management sitting right here, as well as your use effect. So effect part hasn't really changed all that much, with the exceptions being your setter now is your dispatch. So this illustrates, how we make use of reducer hook to manage complex state informations inside an app.